Perhaps I should first explain that I have been involved with psychotherapy for years, and talking to the staff of a psychiatric institution has been one of the main things I do. Most of the psychiatric hospitals in California, and for that matter all over the country, and something that has constantly worried me about almost all the schools of psychotherapy is what I'm going to call a lack of metaphysical depth. A certain shallowness which results from having a philosophical unconscious which has not been examined. Now, I'm a philosopher, and as a philosopher I am grateful to some of the great pioneers in psychotherapy like Freud and Jung, Adler, for pointing out to us philosophers unconscious emotional forces which underlie our opinions. Or say, I'm also in a way a theologian, not a partisan theologian. I don't belong to any particular religion because I don't consider that to be intellectually respectable. But we are grateful for showing how our unconscious and unexamined emotional tendencies influence the ideas which we hold. It's a very valuable insight. But we, in our turn, are interested in the unconscious intellectual assumptions which underlie psychotherapy. They're enormously interesting because psychotherapy, by and large, is a product of the philosophy of nature of the 19th century. And from my point of view, that is not an exact science, but a mythology. And it is taken for granted the philosophy of nature of the 19th century has become the common sense of the 20th century. Very widely accepted in the medical profession, in the psychotherapeutic professions, sociology, but from the point of view of a physicist or a very advanced mathematician or biologist, there is a serious question as to whether psychiatry is a genuine science, even whether medicine is a genuine science. Because these professions have not in a way caught up with quantum theory and are still holding Newtonian views of the universe. That is to say, thinking about their subjects in terms of mechanical models. We hear constant reference to unconscious mental mechanisms. What on earth are you talking about? Psychoanalysis is to a very large degree psychohydraulics. An analogy or model of the behavior of the so-called psyche based on Newton's analysis of the mechanics of water. And so we hear of a basic notion of psychic energy as libido. Now, libido means blind lust. And it operates according to the pleasure principle, which comes into conflict with something else called the reality principle. And one of the difficulties of the human being is that the whole length of the spinal cord separates the brain from the genitals. And so they're never quite together. In other words, our pleasures are not close enough to our minds. This was one reason why the dinosaur was not an adaptive species, because it had to have two brains, one near its rectum and one in its head. And there was a famous caveman who kept a dinosaur as an alarm clock. And what he would do was, when he went to bed at night, he would hit it on its tail with a club, and it would scream in time for him to wake up in the morning. And this is one of our basic difficulties. We don't have our head and our sex together. And it was therefore quite natural, in a way, for Freud to go to sex, or to the libido, as fundamental to everything we were doing and thinking, creating in art and religion and so forth. But his view of the nature of sex was extremely primitive, because he was, after all, a very respectable bourgeois Viennese Jewish doctor who really didn't approve of sex at all, but felt that it was a force that had to be faced, and that human life had to be governed in such a way that sexual urge was respected. So he evolved a new school whereby you trained the horse by giving it lumps of sugar when it reacted properly, instead of beating it. And so I once underwent psychoanalysis for a little while, and I was very amused by the whole procedure, because the doctor was obviously bored with what he was doing, and I beguiled him in such a way that he became more interested in what I had to say than in what he had to say. We got completely off the track of any problems I might have had. And he started learning from me. And my wife had exactly the same experience. She was analyzed by one of the direct apostolic successors of Freud, and in the end he was asking her all the questions to inform himself, and she said, "Next time, why don't we meet at the St. Regis bar instead of in your office?" So what we're looking at is this, is that the basic models underlying the practice of psychotherapy, by and large, I mean, there are exceptions to this, and you must always understand that I'm going to make exaggerations and outrageous generalizations for purposes of discussion rather than laying down the law. But by and large, the world view upon which our practice is based is the world view of scientific naturalism of the 19th century, And this has as its fundamental assumption that the energy which we express is basically stupid. Blind energy, the libido, and it's called the unconscious. I once spent 2 hours with Jung, who was a very wonderful man, very intuitive, very bright. And the first thing he told me, incidentally, was that he wasn't a Jungian. And he wanted to discuss the question of what parallel conception was there in Indian philosophy to the unconscious. And I said, it's interesting, but the only possible phrase that you can find in Sanskrit which will fit the unconscious is alaya vijnana. But the word vijnana means consciousness. And alaya means store, sort of a bank of potentials, which he would have called in his language archetypes. But the point was that the unconscious is what is conscious, and is not stupid at all. You will see this if you compare the work of Freud with the work of George Grodek. They are very alike in a way, and in some ways, if you read Grodek, he's more Freudian than Freud, more sexy, but he enjoys it. He doesn't really secretly disapprove of it. And his book of the It, for example, which is now available in paperback, expresses a profound faith in the unconscious. I had a friend, a very intelligent friend, who read it and said, after reading that book, I'll never again be afraid of becoming sick in any way. I have seen that I can trust my own nature and sort of let go to it. But you see, the assumption of 19th century philosophy of nature was, on the contrary, that the psychobiology of human nature was a stupid mechanism, a fluke that had arisen in a mechanical universe, and that if we were to maintain this fluke and its values, it would therefore be necessary for us to enter into a serious fight with nature. Scientific naturalism was in fact against nature, believing it to be foolish, believing it to be blind, and therefore in need of being dominated by our intelligence, which, paradoxically enough, was a product of this foolishness. But the fluke had happened. Now let's go back into the history of this idea. Western man had always considered, whether he was a Jew, a Muslim, or a Christian, he had always considered the natural universe to be an artifact, something made. And a child in this culture very naturally seems to ask its parents, how was I made? And to make something is to create an artifact. You make a table out of wood or a sculpture out of stone. And therefore, in our basic mythology, underlying our common sense, and this I emphasize, what does underlie our common sense? what are the basic images in terms of which we think. You see, we are mostly unconscious of these. That's why I say that we have an intellectual unconscious. We are mostly unconscious of the basic belief systems in accordance with which we think and behave. And so here is this basic belief system that we are all made. It would be unnatural for a Chinese child to ask, how was I made? He might instead ask, how did I grow? But the idea of our being manufactured objects is basic to almost all Western thought. So that in the course of history, when we got rid of the idea of God as the maker, we were stuck with the idea of the made, of the universe as a mechanism. And we did get rid of the idea of God. People today who believe in God don't really believe in God. They believe that they ought to believe in God. And therefore are somewhat fanatical about it because of their doubt. See, or the strong believer always profoundly doubts what he believes, and therefore wants to compel other people to believe so as to bolster up his own courage. A person who truly believes in God would never try and thrust the idea on anyone else. Just as if you understand mathematics, you are not a fanatical proponent of the idea that 2 and 2 are 4. I mean, you say it's obvious. There's no point to argue about it. It's perfectly clear. So you don't establish a special society and go out fundraising to persuade people that 2 and 2 are 4. So everybody who is a missionary usually doubts the basic assumptions on which he's working. But nevertheless, there they are, and we are stuck with, or have been stuck with, the assumption that the universe is a mechanical construct. Now, what is the difference between a mechanism and an organism? A mechanism is an arrangement of parts that are put together. They are gathered, as it were, from separate places and assembled. Well, no organism comes into being that way. An organism starts as a seed or a cell, a little small I'm at a loss for words, because I won't call it an object, and I won't call it a thing, and I won't even call it an entity. All these words misdescribe what an organism is. Anyway, it starts tiny, and it swells. And as it swells, it becomes more complicated. Not by the addition of parts that are screwed on or welded together, but it has this marvelous capacity of growth. And that's how we all came into being. Now, an organism is incredibly intelligent, and its intelligence surpasses any kind of what we might call mechanical intelligence. For example, Most people cannot comprehend more than 3 variables at the same time without using a pencil. As an example of a variable, let's take a fugue in music. The fugue is a combination of tunes arranged contrapuntally in harmony with each other. Now, a skillful organist has got 2 keyboards, 10 fingers and 2 feet. Okay, so he could, at the maximum, run 12 variables. He could run 12 melodies at the same time, but he'd have to be quite skillful to do so. But 12 variables are very few. The actual situations of life comprise an unknown number of variables. In physics, where we have situations where there are millions of variables, we manage to understand them by statistical methods to predict what will happen. But in the ordinary situations of life, where we are dealing with perhaps several 100,000 variables, we haven't the ghost of a notion how to handle them. Let's take law. Law, with its attempts to regulate human conduct and human disputes, becomes endlessly complicated. Why we have so much law today that you can't do anything without hiring a firm of attorneys. And they don't know what they're doing. Let's take the complexities of tax law. They're endless, because what we've been trying to do is to express what is going on in nature in terms of words and figures. Now, words and figures are strung out in a line. And in order to comprehend the meaning of this line, you have to scan it. You have to run your conscious attention along it. That's why our education takes so long, because we have to scan miles and miles of print and then make sense of it. And conscious attention just can't keep up with it. So in addition to a population bomb, we have an information bomb. You can't possibly keep up with the literature that you need to know in the field of psychotherapy. It's endless. And most of it boring. So we are all scanning lines, because conscious attention is the brain's radar. And you know how radar works. It is the propagation of a beam with a bounce factor in it, which feeds back to the scope. And you keep scanning the environment for changes. If a rock should come up, if a storm should come up, if another vehicle should come up, the radar picks it up. So our consciousness, our conscious attention, is very much the same kind of process. But that is only a minimal part of our total psychic functioning, because the brain as a whole, the nervous system as a whole, regulates, organizes all kinds of psychic and physical functioning without thinking about it. In other words, you don't know how you beat your heart. You don't know how you make a decision. You don't know how you breathe. You may, if you're a physiologist, have some idea of it, but that doesn't enable you to do it any better than somebody who doesn't know. But all this incredibly intricate function is carried on unconsciously. Always say it's by the brain. But what is the brain? No, nobody really knows. One of my great friends is Carl Pribram, who is the professor of neuropsychiatry at Stanford. And he has a marvelous understanding of the brain. But he is the first person to admit that he doesn't really understand it at all. He's fascinated. And he shows us the most amazing things. How the brain creates the world which it sees. If you want a simple explanation of this, read J.Z. Young's book, Doubt and Certainty in Science. And he begins with the brains of octopuses, which are very simple brains and fairly easy to understand. And then he goes on to the human brain and shows how we are, by what we are, creating the kind of world that we think we live in. The brain, the nervous system, evokes the world, but is also something in the world. What an egg and hen situation that is. But what he's doing is he is stating in very sophisticated language some of the ancient philosophical problems. When Bishop Berkeley explained that the world is entirely in our minds, he had a very vague idea of the mind. What is the mind? Well, everybody used to think that the mind was something like space. It had no form of its own, but was able to contain forms, like a mirror, which has no color, but reflects all colors, like the eye lens, which has no color, but is able to see all colors. So this is this vague idea of the mind. Well, now the neurologist studying the brain gets a very precise idea of the mind. He can say it's its structures. It has all these neurons, dendrites, and what have you, pathways. But in the end, he comes to exactly the same thing. He's saying the world is what your brain evokes. And so we're back where we started. Only in a more complicated and a more rigorous way. But complexity, nature is assumed to be complex. We say the world is complicated, not only in its biology, in its geology, in its astronomy, but also in its politics, its economics. Actually, the world isn't complicated at all. What is complicated is the attempt to translate the world into linear symbols. If I would want to move the Pacific Ocean over across to the Atlantic by using a fork, I would find it an incredibly complicated enterprise. So in the same way, to translate what is going on in nature into linear series of symbols, whether they be words or whether they be numbers, is unbelievably complicated, because it's the wrong way to do it. If you'd use your brains instead of your minds, you might have better success. What I mean by the word mind, the systems of symbolism that we use intellectually. So you start out then with the realization that your brain, whatever that is unbelievably intelligent. well organized. It is an organ. And incidentally, an organ is something quite different from an organization. Organizations are invariably stupid. Never deal with an organization, always deal with a person. When people get together and organize, they have to, you see, regulate the organization by writing out a set of rules. And you know these charts you see in any organization where it says president, vice president, secretary, etc., and then there's a delegation of authority looking like a family tree. And then you have a book of bylaws and constitution and articles. All these are linear rules as to how the organization is to operate, and therefore unintelligent, oversimplified. And so when people, we have a society of psychiatrists in San Francisco, all of the members of it are extremely wise and fine people, very good in their practice. But when they act in a corporate capacity, they're impossible. They are inhuman. They are just terrible. They shan't be named. But their organization is awful, because they have to go by the rules. They have to go by the book. And you can't go by the book. The book is nothing more, it's like musical notation. It's a kind of aide-memoire. But the musician, in order to produce the notation, has to bring the incredible suppleness of his body to work on the instrument or to sing. So you do see what I'm developing. I'm developing the idea that what we are physically is far more intelligent than what we are intellectually. That behind our minds and our books and our schedules and our laws and our mathematics, there is something far more intelligent than anything we can record. So naturally, when you get into the practice of psychotherapy, you have first of all gone through school, and you've read a lot of textbooks, and you've seen a lot of procedures, and they've been explained. Incidentally, do you know what explained means? It means to lay out flat, to put it on a plane. See, if I wanted to explain a beautiful woman, and I put her under a steamroller and laid her out flat. There it is, everybody. Here are all the parts, and they go like this and this and this and this. They're like those slices people take of fetuses and enlarge them and so on, so that you can see what a fetus really is. You've got it explained. But a fetus laid out flat is no fetus. It's like blood in a test tube. It's not the same process as blood in the veins, because it's out of context. Blood in the veins is in a certain situation. It is what it is because of its relationship to a vast system. But in a test tube where it's isolated, it's not the same thing. A thing is where it is. So, let's begin to realize that we have identified ourselves with a process of mentation or consciousness, which is not really ourselves at all. And let's have the humility to see that. Human character by genetic manipulation. And therefore, we want to know what you people think about this. What sort of human characters should we produce? Wowee. So, there were various views offered, and I said, of course you can't know, because you yourself are genetically unregenerate. You yourself are the product of the random selection of nature. And therefore, by your own showing, you must be a mess. And so you, as a mess, cannot decide what would be the proper order of things. So I said, the only thing you can do is to ensure that there be as many different kinds of human being as possible. Because we don't know what kinds of human beings we need. Or at one period we need people who cooperate, who be good team workers. At another period we need rugged individualists who have their own ideas and go ahead and persuade everybody else to follow them. We're in a teamwork situation right now. Everybody is always looking out of the corner of their eye to see what everybody else is doing. Consult David Reisman, the other directed people. So, we don't know. What is the right way to proceed evolutionarily? We haven't the faintest idea. I mean, we all seem to agree nowadays that we should go on doing what we're doing. That is, that we should survive. I'm not at all sure about this. There are two schools of thought about life. Take the analogy of fire. Some people think a good fire is a colossally bright blaze that is a flash like lightning. Well, that was something, wasn't it? Man, a flash of lightning. Other people say, oh, no, that's a waste of energy. Cool it. Keep it down to a dull glow which goes on for a long, long time. So that this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. And as Chesterton replied, you may go off with a whimper, but we will go off with a bang. Well, what should it be? See, what should life be? Would you, supposing you were confronted with a choice, you were going to spend one night with the most beautiful woman imaginable, or man, and have the most incredible orgiastic experience, and then die. Or with some rather indifferent, not very exciting companion for a long, long time, so that you would be bored. Which will you choose? And we find that very difficult to decide. Because, in the ordinary way, we are not really aware of life, because we're using our conscious attention too much. I mean, we are thinking that we are our opinion of ourselves, our image of ourselves. And therefore, we are feeling ourselves as reduced to linear symbolism. And that's a kind of strung-out, skinny thing. It's sort of starved. It's all skin and bones and no flesh. And so when you think of yourself as your ego or as your personality, this is an entirely fictitious account of yourself, lacking in richness. And if you are identified with that, you feel impoverished, and you have to go to a psychiatrist. So I feel frustrated. Of course you do. Well, the psychiatrist also feels frustrated, because by and large he has the same opinion of himself. and thinks he's an ego. Whereas his id, an id, nobody should be an id. Because that's an idiot. You know, the primordial sludge. But the id is very intelligent. See, this is what Freud didn't get. Got it. Jung got it, in a way. Or he was scared of it. But that id is a marvel. And you have to trust it because you don't really have any alternative. The id is not entirely trustworthy. It will sometimes do very unpredictable things that don't seem to be rational. But realize this, that in any control system, the establishment of perfect control is the death of the system. A society which is a police state is a dead society. A society which is not a police state is a dangerous society. A police state is safe, but boring. A free state is not at all boring, but dangerous. Now, presumably, as citizens of the United States, you've opted for a free state. It's scary. Most of our people don't want it. They say there should be a law against it. We want law and order. That means they want to be fascists, because they're terrified of freedom. But freedom is the only thing that works. If I don't trust you, I can't live with you. I've got to make the gamble, even though it will sometimes be betrayed. I've got to make the gamble of trusting you. I can't go out of my door without a fundamental sense that I can trust my neighbors. So in the same way, I cannot make a single decision without the fundamental sense of trust in my own brain. Because I don't know how my brain works. How the hell do I know if I'm not crazy? I have no way of determining. I may be absolutely nutty as a fruitcake. But nevertheless, I have to trust my brain. Now, the trouble with most of people who are, as we say, crazy, is they can't trust themselves. And clinically, one has somehow or other to get these people to trust themselves again. Now, you can't do that if you're uptight. If you, in the company of a so-called crazy person, feel ill at ease, and that, my God, at all costs we've got to get this person to conform and do things according to the book, you're going to get nowhere. You've got to be able yourself to be as crazy as a crazy person in order to be a therapist. I'm not a therapist for the simple reason that it takes too much energy to sit. I admire therapists who can sit hour after hour after hour in a consulting room and talk to people with troubles. Oh, I admire it. I admire a dentist for the same reason. I can't do it. But I sometimes have to. And I had a case a little while ago which I wish I could have followed through. a very, very charming woman, great artist, about 65 years old, who was clubbed in New York on the street, robbed, thrown into an automobile, taken up to Harlem, and discarded on the street. Her husband picked her up after 2 days' search in a hospital. Her mentality completely gone. Everything had vanished. And she could only speak as much English as, say, a 3-year-old child. But most of the time she was babbling. So I said to her husband, who's a great friend of mine, I'd really like to see her. Well, he said, you'll find she's an awful mess. I said, never mind, let's try. I don't know what's going to work. Well, I sat with this woman for an hour, and we had a long conversation. If you didn't know what language we were talking, you would have assumed that we were carrying on in a very intelligent and sociable way. I was talking nonsense to her. Complete nonsense. But the social amenities, everything, was perfectly in order. I hadn't the faintest notion what I was saying. But I just let my voice wander, as she was letting her voice wander, and we got on very well. And her husband was astonished, and he said, I have tried the same thing now, and I'm not anxious about her anymore. We've got a good relationship going.